April 7, 1945. The morning opens like any other over the vast Pacific, but by late afternoon, the sky above Tokyo will erupt in a way it never has before. For the first time in the war, American single-seat fighters fly through the airspace of the Japanese home islands to stand between the massive B-29 formations and the interceptors sent to meet them. What begins as an experiment will become the birth of a small, tight-knit fraternity of pilots who called themselves, informally, the Tokyo Club. Their missions will stretch machines and men to the limit, and the lessons they learn will change the air campaign over Japan. If you love deep-dive WWII aviation history, hit subscribe now and stay with me. This is one of those stories that sounds like legend until you look at the mission logs. The problem was simple and stubborn. The Army Air Forces had poured crews and planes into the B-29 program, building the most advanced long-range bomber yet seen. From the Marianas, these superfortresses could reach the Japanese industrial heartland. But bombing from high altitude in that theater was a poor fit for the technology of the moment. Jet streams sheared bomber formations, blowing their bomb patterns wide. Precision daylight raids missed by miles. The solution, for months, had been to switch tactics. Low-altitude, nighttime incendiary raids that devastated cities, but which often spared specific factories and dispersed industrial production. Strategic bombing needed a middle path, accuracy without sacrificing crew survivability. That middle path arrived in the form of a desperate, audacious idea: bring fighter escorts closer to the Japanese mainland. The island of Iwo Jima, taken at enormous cost only weeks earlier, had a specific strategic value beyond its bloody beaches. Its airfields sat roughly halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese home islands. If P-51 Mustangs could operate from those fields, fighters could meet the B-29s on the leg into Japan and ride shotgun over the target, keeping enemy interceptors at bay. The calculus was brutal. The fighters would have to extend their range to the limits and beyond. They would fly missions bordering on 8 hours. They would operate from an island still raw from combat, with ground support scarce and conditions harsh. The Very Long Range concept, VLR, was not a doctrine, it was an improvisation. Pilots and mechanics had to fit Mustangs with extra tanks, accept heavier takeoffs, and trust estimated fuel calculations that left almost no margin for error. Takeoff and climb would burn precious fuel. The run to rendezvous could be hours over empty ocean, with only radio bearings and the stars to guide you. Navigation was often reduced to following the B-29s themselves. The big bombers acted as beacons as much as targets. If anything went wrong, a radio died, a gun jammed, a heading was misread, there were no convenient airstrips between you and a watery grave.
Iwo Jima itself was a study in contrasts. The island's volcanic soil kicked up fine ash that clogged filters and scarred engines. Runways were patched with urgency. Tents and makeshift barracks replaced proper billets. Showers were rare, and the smell of salt and oil was constant. Medical facilities tried to cope. Pilots lived close to the aircraft they flew. For many, the island felt like a frontline airbase writ small, forward, improvised, exposed. The first scheduled mass use of these VLR escorts came on April 7, 1945. Nearly 400 B-29s climbed toward Tokyo, aiming for the Nakajima aircraft factory, a linchpin of Japanese fighter production. From Iwo, groups of P-51s scrambled, taking on extra tanks and a mission they had not flown before in scale or distance. The Mustangs and their pilots were on a bet. Keep the bombers intact long enough for them to wreak precise havoc on the factory, and the balance of air power would shift. As the formations close, tension tightens like a curb on a spring. Present tense takes the fight for a moment. Engines scream. The sea beneath is a blue ribbon. The sky ahead is a pale dome, and the black of Tokyo looms with searchlights and anti-aircraft bursts. Japanese interceptors, fighters like the Ki-44 and Ki-61, climb to meet the raiders in force. Around the B-29 stream, a separate fight opens up. Dozens of single-seat Mustangs threading through tracer and cloud, eyeballing thin black silhouettes that move with lethal intent. The engagement is fierce, compressed into minutes that stretch like hours in a pilot's head. The Mustangs dart, slice, and peel. They split to cover bombers being targeted. They push home deflections and tight-turning attacks. The surprise is total. These are not the short-range fighters who have been pressing coastal raids for years. These Mustangs are fresh in the defenders' skies, mounting aggressive interception of the interceptors. By day's end, the after-action reads like a proving ground. The Mustangs claim 26 Japanese fighters destroyed in that engagement. The bomber force loses only 3 B-29s. On the Iwo side, word comes back in clipped radio bursts and the slow, hushed telegrams that travel by ship later. Officers file reports that read like a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. Pilots who had felt the raw edge of air combat in Europe were startled by the scale and the stakes here. Major Jim Tapp, recorded as the top scorer in that first fight, pushes his plane hard that afternoon, finding the angles and controlling the dogfight tempo. Lieutenant Dick Hintermeer is among the pilots who throw themselves into the breach, protective and relentless. Captain Bob D., flying a Mustang with the Green Tail Squadron emblem, is there in the fray, nicking and weaving with the rest.
One small story captures the improvisational courage that day. First Lieutenant Robert Scamra, separated from his flight in the chaos, finds himself alone with a single B-29 that has fallen behind the main stream. Instead of turning for home, Scamra stays with the straggling bomber, keeping Japanese attackers at bay until other escorts can rejoin. There are no medals handed out on the tarmac that night. There are, instead, handshakes and quiet nods, and a shared awareness that staying with a bomber can be the difference between survival and annihilation. A veteran later summarized the shock of that first contact in a simple way, not as a boast, but as a fact. Once fighters began to meet the B-29s over Japan, bomber losses dropped considerably on missions where escorts were present. The data from April 7 supported that view. More than that, the psychological effect mattered. Bomber crews who had long flown with a sense of naked exposure now had, for the first time in this theater, a shield. The B-29 became less a solitary vessel cutting through hostile skies and more a formation protected by agile guardians. The victory was not without its cost. Success at that scale invited more attention from commanders and more sorties from pilots. The Japanese adapted, probing for weaknesses. Mechanical gremlins reared up in new places. Volcanic ash abraded air filters and accelerated wear on pistons. Guns, fed with ammunition on ships or hastily supplied reloads, sometimes failed at the worst moment. Radios, the lifeline of coordinated escort, sputtered under humidity and salt. Even the extra fuel tanks introduced new risks. They added weight on takeoff, increased stall speed, and required careful switching in flight that could be fatal if a pilot misread his gauges. Life on Iwo could be cruelly ordinary between missions. Crews repaired what they could with a skeleton staff of specialists. Pilots traded parts and favors. Makeshift baths, laughably called spas by the men, were brief and prized. Flight surgeons tried hard to keep men fit. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Smokey Walther, who oversaw medical efforts and later organized daring rescue initiatives, moved among the tents trying to patch both physical and morale wounds. The work of a surgeon on an island like Iwo is rarely clean or tidy. It is improvisation under fire, field fixes, hurried surgeries, and relentless lists of supplies that never quite match needs. The strategic calculus pushed on. Having proved the escort concept on April 7, planners looked to expand operations. But expansion meant increased exposure. Escort missions multiplied. Fighter sweeps were ordered against airfields known to house kamikaze units. These sweeps were more than air superiority missions, they were preemptive strikes intended to reduce the flow of pilot sacrifice tactics that already had marked the Japanese air strategy. Flying low and fast over hostile airfields to strafe parked aircraft and fuel dumps changed the conventional escort profile. Fighters that had spent hours preserving bombers began to spend long minutes dipping into perilously low altitudes to remove threats before they could rise. On April 12, only days after that first triumph, the unit met the harsher arithmetic of war. Combat escalated, and the first significant air-to-air loss for the new VLR escorts is recorded. First Lieutenant James Bay was killed in action. Details are sparse and raw in the official report. The facts are folded into terse sentences that never quite capture the human dimensions. Bay's Mustang went down. The pilot did not return. Names like his move through the narrative and stop being abstract. They become anchors of grief on the island, on the decks where men who had flown with him stand in silence and stare at the horizon. Not all losses came from bullets. Sometimes the plane failed the man. First Lieutenant Fred White suffered a catastrophic event after one mission. Flak or shrapnel apparently ingested into his chute pack area rendered his escape impossible. A parachute failure after being hit, a nightmare every airman carried. The technical reports later catalog details: shell fragments, torn harnesses. But on the ground there is the raw human result. Another pilot never walks from the flight line again. The psychological weight of those deaths is hard to quantify. Pilots wrote home in letters that mix boredom with terror, the two twin companions of aerial warfare. One man described watching friends vanish in the sea like black spots on the water, and then landing as if nothing had happened, a testimony to the compartmentalization that kept many alive. The island's small graves and weather-bleached markers multiply as the months press on. Tactically, the unit adapted quickly. Pilots learned to conserve fuel yet still press home attacks. They refined rendezvous procedures with B-29 navigators and worked on in-flight signals to account for radio failures. Mechanics modified filters and scavenged parts. If anything, the capacity to adapt manifested social forms as well. Small crews huddled over maps and sketches late into the night, arguing headings and alternate fields. Pilots who survived close calls took on informal mentorships, pulling younger men aside to show them small tricks that can keep engines alive or a wing from stalling on a heavy takeoff. By mid-April, the concept had moved beyond a single mission. April 16 saw fighter sweeps expressly aimed at disrupting kamikaze preparations. Pilots flew low and fast across hostile fields, firing into parked aircraft and supply dumps. These were brutal missions. Strafing runs exposed men to concentrated small arms fire, anti-aircraft bursts, and the constant risk of misjudging height over unfamiliar terrain. Yet, the logic was clear. The more the VLR Mustangs could degrade the enemy on the ground, the fewer suicide attacks would reach the fleet and the bomber streams. The costs multiplied in different registers. Mechanical attrition, broken landing gear, engine seizures, jammed guns, claimed aircraft without any enemy in sight. The ocean took its share when pilots had to bail out over water and rescue was delayed or impossible. Mid-air collisions, the most unforgiving of accidents, happened when visibility dropped, when weather closed in, or when formations broke under attack. The skill that keeps a formation tight in perfect conditions can become dangerous in storm-driven disarray. And then there were the human, small-scale stories that quietly animate the operational record. A pilot, back from a mission, sits on his plane's wing and quietly hands over his logbook to a buddy. A mechanic, huddling under a wing in the rain, manages to weld a cracked mount just in time for the next scramble. A nurse, exhausted from treating burned hands and bitter lungs, scrawls a list of men missing after a sortie. These are the micro-scenes that, assembled, explain why a tactical innovation like VLR Escort becomes more than a paper recommendation. It is sweat, ingenuity, and the grinding repetition of danger. Amid these daily dramas, personalities emerge. Captain Todd Moore, known for his green-tailed Mustang and steady leadership, becomes a figure pilots look to in flight briefings. Some guys are nicknamed and survive the nickname's weight. Smokey Walther remains the surgeon who will later risk small improvised rescues for downed men. Major Tapp's name is on the lips of many that first victory week. And then there are the pilots who never make it into the squadron's group photos. Men like James Whiteman, who bailed out but suffered a parachute failure, or the others who vanish into reports that never have enough adjectives. As April moves toward May, the pace intensifies. Missions are planned with finer detail. Briefings emphasize alternate plans, bailout protocols, and emergency rendezvous points. Fuel dumps are recalculated, and radios are tested more obsessively. Pilots start to speak of the way the sky itself seems to change, not in color, but in the psychology of it. Bits of intelligence about enemy tactics feed into a nervous expectation that the next sortie could tip the balance or break a streak of good luck. And yet, for all the adaptation and the fierce courage, a single variable remains stubborn: weather. Storms over the Pacific are not merely an inconvenience, they are an operational variable that can rearrange an entire sortie. A navigational error in clear weather can be corrected. In swirling squalls, it becomes fatal. The P-51, nimble and fast, can be at the mercy of a cloud bank that scatters formations. The B-29 stream, vast and ponderous, cannot fold itself to every gust. Weather will, in the months ahead, reveal itself not only as a natural force, but as a strategic adversary. The successes of early April carry the Tokyo Club forward with both swagger and a sober recognition of fragility. Command sees tangible benefit. Escorts reduce bomber losses and give planners greater confidence to attempt precision raids. For the pilots, there is a renewed sense of purpose. They fly not just for the abstract charts of strategic effect, but for men in those B-29 turrets who wave when they see a Mustang climbing to cover. For the ground crews, late-night repairs feel worth the risk because the bomber crews come back. But adaptation breeds further commitment from the enemy. The Imperial Japanese Command shuffles interceptors, refines ground control vectors, and fields countermeasures. Pilots returning from April missions report the intensity of anti-aircraft flak increasing in certain corridors. And Japanese fighters begin to probe the edges of the escort screen, probing where the VLR coverage starts to thin. The months that follow will test that thin edge. Already, the diaries and mission logs begin to show a pattern. A bruise of victories scattered between small tragedies. A mechanical failure here, a misread heading there. Each incident is a data point that both the pilots and their commanders cannot ignore. They will adjust tactics, adding new rendezvous points and revising fuel policies. They will push the Mustangs into roles beyond pure escort. Low-level strafing, suppression of flak positions, and direct attacks on airfields. The Mustang's versatility becomes both an asset and a demand. It asks of pilots that they master both sustained, long-range formation flying and the brutal, precise work of ground attack. Through it all, human cost remains a relentless ledger. For every B-29 saved, there is a story of a pilot who did not come home. For every pilot who racks up a string of victories, there are the nights when lightning and engine failures look like bigger threats than enemy guns. The Tokyo Club's reputation grows, but with it the tally of empty bunks and black-bordered memos. As spring moves towards summer, the scene sets itself for a harsher test. Operations step up, sweeps grow bolder, weather patterns shift. And the pilots who had seen their first great success over Tokyo know, in the quiet between briefings, that the real measure of their efforts will not be a single fight, but the relentless months to come. The ability to hold formation, to keep learning, to keep men alive despite every new hazard. There is one last element that begins to define the VLR story in these weeks: the improvisation of rescue and recovery. The ocean is a graveyard and a puzzle.
Early on, pilots who ditch or bail over water depend on small boats and the caprice of currents. Lieutenant Colonel Walther, uncomfortable with the passive calculus of waiting, begins to push for more proactive measures.
The idea is simple and moral. If you can improve the odds of recovering a downed pilot, you ought to try. What starts as informal requests for faster boat dispatches and closer coordination with naval units grows into more organized efforts. Protocols for life vest checks, experiments with signaling devices, and a small, stubborn attempt to beat the ocean's lethality with human planning. The island's physicians organize field trials. Crews test CO2 life vest inflators, check the integrity of emergency flares, and catalog which types of injuries are survivable at sea and which are not. It is necessary, grim work, but it matters. When a pilot touches down in the water and the rescue boat arrives within an hour instead of several, survival increases. For the community on Iwo, every extra life returned is proof that their improvisation and stubbornness have a shape and value. By late April, the Tokyo Club can point to real effects. Bomber losses on escorted runs drop, Japanese interceptor numbers thin in several contested corridors, and the character of air engagements changes. Yet the season ahead is not paged with certainties. The improvisations that preserve life will not be enough against every contingency. Weather, enemy adaptation, mechanical attrition, and the slow, grinding stress of months of sorties will continue to test men and machines. As the calendar flips forward, the pilots themselves begin to speak more of endurance than of glory. They measure success not only in kills, but in the number of bomber crews who wave at them from their turrets and live to chew dried food and write home another night. They count fuel burn and radio checks with the same reverence they used to reserve for victory claims. The mood becomes one of careful vigilance. Celebrate wins, learn fast from losses, and never, ever assume the fight stops with a single good day over Tokyo. And yet, even with that cautious, almost professional restraint, an undercurrent of foreboding grows. The same conditions that produced April 7th's dramatic success are brittle. A navigational error, a sudden storm, a bunching of formations at the wrong altitude, any of these could turn a victory into a casualty list. The pilots know this in the bones. They are beginning to speak of the sky as a place of strange moods, generous and cruel in equal measure. Spring is giving way to the heavy weather that will define the months ahead. Tensions on the island harden into routine. Pilots sharpen their instincts. Mechanics learn to coax more hours out of stressed airframes. But the calendar waits for no one. Plans for bigger escort operations, for more aggressive fighter sweeps, and for extended roles beyond escorting are moving through command channels. The Tokyo Club's next tests are being scheduled as you read these lines. The successes of April have bought time and legitimacy, but they have also opened a door through which far greater risks will pass.
Plans that were sketched in briefings harden into orders. By late May, the Tokyo Club flies with a discipline born of repetition. Precise rendezvous, staggered tank switching, and a tacit code about staying with a wounded bomber no matter the personal risk. Yet the calendar holds a sudden, merciless test. Weather, the one variable men can neither coax nor command, moves across the Pacific with a speed that surprises no sailor and terrifies every pilot who has watched a gray bank swallow the horizon. June 1st opens under a low ceiling and a wind that does not look promising. Briefings are hurried. Meteorological reports are thin and sometimes contradictory. Command wants the mission flown, a major escort operation to support a deep penetration raid that could again strike at Japanese aircraft factories and supply centers. The P-51s roll for takeoff in long lines, fuel tanks heavy, radios checked and rechecked. The B-29 stream climbs, lumbering and beautiful, like a slow-moving city rising into the cloud. For weeks, the Mustang crews have taken comfort in routine. Today, routine will be rent. As the formations head toward Japan, a storm bank thickens ahead. Visibility drops. Instruments begin to matter as never before. Pilots glance at compass headings and hourly fuel estimates with a keenness born of habit and fear.
Radio chatter becomes sparse, then urgent. A sudden wind shear pushes elements of the fighter screen off their planned track. B-29s, so steady in formation, begin to spread under the stress of the weather. The escort picture dissolves into fragments. Confusion breeds collision. Planes that should have been three abreast find themselves converging in the same corridor of sky. A mid-air clang, the sound of metal where metal ought not to meet, occurs without cinematic warning and is final in a way bullets sometimes are not. Aircraft are lost not to enemy guns, but to the unforgiving geometry of clouds and wings. Others, separated from the main group and low on fuel, run out before they can find a place to land. By the day's end, the tally reads like a nightmare. Roughly 148 fighters launched and 24 aircrew lost in a single brutal day. The unit calls it, quietly and with the weight of understatement so common in military records, Black Friday. The emotional architecture of the island shifts. Victory and pride, which had softened the edges of fear, give way to a raw sorrow that is nearly physical. Men who walked the line that night talk less of strategy and more of the hollow feeling of missing faces at the mess table. Survivors later describe a sky that felt like a closed room. One Mustang pilot recalls flying into a wall of cloud and then emerging to see a smoking aircraft where a wing should have been. Another speaks of a plain, mechanical fear. Not the quick, sharp adrenaline of combat, but the slow, cold realization that navigation failures and weather were as lethal as any opponent. By the day's end, the tally reads like a nightmare. Roughly 148 fighters launched and 24 aircrew lost in a single, brutal day. The unit calls it, quietly and with the weight of understatement so common in military records, Black Friday. The emotional architecture of the island shifts. Victory and pride, which had softened the edges of fear, give way to a raw sorrow that is nearly physical. Men who walked the line that night talk less of strategy and more of the hollow feeling of missing faces at the mess table. Survivors later describe a sky that felt like a closed room. One Mustang pilot recalls flying into a wall of cloud and then emerging to see a smoking aircraft where a wing should have been. Another speaks of a plain, mechanical fear. Not the quick, sharp adrenaline of combat, but the slow, cold realization that navigation failures and weather were as lethal as any opponent.
Radios, already fragile in salt air, crackled and failed. Compasses, sometimes misled by electrical interference, betrayed headings that would have kept men safe. The storm did not care about tactics or heroism. It cared only that the men were vulnerable. The island answered in its own way. Medical tents overflowed with wounded. Search and rescue crews pushed out in small boats and, where possible, with improvised surface craft. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph "Smoky" Walther, already known on Iwo for his steady hands and restless ingenuity, coordinated desperate efforts that could not always match the scale of the disaster. Boats reached some men in time. Others were gone before help could arrive. The sea is an indifferent judge. It accepts men and rarely offers them back. Black Friday became a pivot in more ways than one. Tactically, commanders were forced to reckon with limits. The VLR concept had stretched fighters to near breaking point, and natural forces could still undo the best-laid procedures. Psychologically, the unit absorbed a stark lesson. Success demands humility, and improvisation has limits. But the men who survived did not fold. They retooled, argued, and adapted. Losses were recorded and studied. Briefings added more contingencies for weather. Navigational beacons were re-examined. Alternate landing fields and emergency procedures were revised. Less than 2 weeks later, on June 10, the Tokyo Club would be called on to prove that it could endure both tragedy and tactical surprise. The mission that day was conceived differently, not as a desperate stretch into the unknown, but as a calibrated demonstration. Push back against Japanese air concentrations, exploit intelligence about enemy dispositions, and teach the defenders that American fighters could come in waves, regroup, and return with lethal precision.
The June 10 operation unfolds with a confidence that betrays many sleepless nights of recalculation. Pilots brief for contingencies. Communications are tightened. Weather forecasts are watched obsessively. When the fighters and B-29s take off, there is a new clarity. Routes are cleaner. Rendezvous points are better defined. The escort finds its bearings, and when contact comes, it comes with a cold efficiency. Japanese fighters that rise to intercept meet a wall of Mustangs primed for engagement. In the ensuing fights, the Mustang pilots press with coordinated aggression. Boom and zoom attacks, energy tactics that favor the P-51's speed and dive characteristics, and a readiness to disengage rather than be drawn into low-altitude traps. The results are unmistakable. On that day, the Japanese pay a heavy price, with numerous aircraft lost and their interception efforts blunted decisively. American losses are light, remarkably so given the scale of the operation. June 10 stands for the unit as a counterpoint to Black Friday, proof that the system could learn, adjust, and recover.
It is not a vindication that erases grief, but it changes the narrative arc from one of brittle expansion to gradual mastery. With momentum returned, commanders shift the fighter's role yet again. Escorts remain critical, but Mustangs are now deployed for tactical interdiction, low-level strafing, suppression of anti-aircraft positions, and attacks on airfields where the Japanese cluster both planes and personnel. Flying low to strafe is different work. It brings pilots face-to-face with small arms fire, with the risk of ground-based explosives and treacherous terrain. It requires precise judgment and the kind of nerves that are steady under the smell of burning gasoline and the sharp crack of tracer. Some pilots adapt naturally to the ground attack role, others do not. But as the weeks pass, the Mustang proves versatile. It can run long missions at altitude and then, on different days, dive into the fray to peel wings off parked aircraft or destroy fuel depots. These sorties exact a cost that is distinct from aerial combat. Ground fire chews on undercarriages and radiators. P-51s that return from strafing runs sometimes look as if they had been through a grinder, dented panels, shattered plexiglass, and engines with 1 or 2 cylinders missing. Pilots come home with hands scorched by cockpit heat and faces raw from the blast of open canopies at high speed. The island's surgeons and medics, including Walther, see different wounds now: burns, shrapnel abrasions, and the kind of blunt force trauma that comes from forced landings in rough beaches. Some individual stories from this period are small and terrible. Lieutenant Richard Schroepel, shot down over the water, account books record, survived impact long enough to be seen in the sea. Witnesses later reported a distressing scene in which the downed pilot was targeted while afloat. Rescue attempts were made, but the cruel arithmetic of combat sometimes denied the island's best efforts. The record is laconic and clinical. A name appears on the ledger, men on Iwo place another empty chair at dinner. These are moments handled by the community in a way that is intimate and slow. Letters sealed, chaplains consulted, and mates trying to find steady words at the next roll call. Lieutenant Colonel Walther's rescue experiments continued amid this grinding tempo. He championed faster dispatch of small craft and worked with naval liaison officers to station picket boats closer to likely bailout corridors. Life vest testing became systematic. CO2 inflators were inspected, seam integrity in survival gear cataloged, and pilots were trained repeatedly in ditching procedures. The pragmatic ethos of "do what you can with what you have" kept gaining small victories. When a pilot was recovered within an hour of ditching, the island celebrated the retrieval as if it were a battle won. Each extra life returned justified the muddy labor of innovation. As summer presses on, the operational ledger grows both in victories and in sorrow. The Mustangs inflict mounting losses on Japanese air power and infrastructure. Strafing runs crater supply dumps, destroy grounded fighters, and hamper sorties. Escort missions continue to protect B-29 raids, and on many missions, bomber losses drop when fighters are present. But the price is cumulative. Attrition eats at pilots and planes alike. Mechanics patch more than they rebuild.
Units return with shorter inventories. Replacements arrive at a slower drumbeat than the combat tempo requires. Across the months, a tally accumulates that is both impressive and grim. By the end of the campaign window, the combined claims attributed to the VLR Mustangs, both in air-to-air victories and in ground destruction, total approximately 452 Japanese aircraft destroyed. It is a number that speaks to effectiveness. Yet the ledger of loss tells a complementary story. Roughly 130 Mustangs are lost in the same period, and about 121 men are recorded as either killed in action or taken as prisoners. Numbers alone cannot carry the moral weight of those names, yet they are necessary to understand the balance between tactical success and human cost. Within that calculus are particular moments, shockingly vivid and endlessly replayed in letters and reunions. "We saved the B-29s," one pilot remembers later, "but we didn't save ourselves for all of it." Others recall the look on a bomber crew's face when a Mustang appears over the formation, a flash of relief so pure that it becomes the private account many pilots keep. The theater-wide effect is tangible. Fewer bombers are lost, key targets become more vulnerable, and the Japanese are forced to reposition their defenses. But the Mustangs do not bring a sudden end to resistance. They change the terms of struggle. They reduce the margin for bomber losses and add a persistent threat to Japanese air operations. That measured change is precisely the kind of course correction the title of this story implies. The Tokyo Club, as a social formation, does not survive intact. Men rotate out for tours, some reassigned, others returning home or to hospitals. The camaraderie that had been so crucial, pilots, ground crew, surgeons, and nurses moving through a shared rhythm, frays and reforms in new configurations. New leaders emerge, and faces at briefings change. The island's photo albums fill with group shots. Names are scratched into the margins of photographs for those who did not return. The unit earns its stripe in the annals of the Pacific Air War, and yet the living remember that the badge was stitched with both triumph and loss. Tactically, the Mustang's integration into these missions redefines expectations. Commanders learn when to press escorts and when to withhold them, how to choreograph rendezvous so that fighters arrive with enough energy to fight and the bombers have enough margin to get home.
The logistical tale, the mechanics, the supply of fuel and ammunition, the patchwork of spare propellers, gains respect as central to victory. VLR operations remain risky. They are never casually recommended. Yet the empirical record, those mission logs, the radio transcripts, the after-action debriefs, show that when Mustangs flew in support, bomber survivability increased measurably. At home and in later histories, this is sometimes compressed into a single sentence. Fighter escorts allowed B-29 missions to be more precise and safer. That sentence is true, but it is also an economy of grief. It elides individual stories. A pilot who learned to switch tanks faster. A mechanic who jury-rigged a filter that kept an engine alive for one more sortie. The surgeon who refused to let a man drown because recovery times were shortened. These details are where the how of change lives. By autumn, the campaign's arc bends toward attrition of the Japanese air defense system. Fighters are withdrawn, reserves are reallocated, and the tempo of interception diminishes in some sectors. The combined effect of relentless bombing, fuel shortages on the Japanese side, and the attrition inflicted by intercepts and strafing reduces the pool of operational enemy aircraft. The Mustang's role shifts again into cleanup and interdiction, mopping up, keeping supply lines under pressure, and denying the enemy the ability to rebuild quickly. The final balance sheet is sobering. The unit's contribution is undeniable in both tactical and operational terms. Hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed, bomber losses reduced on escorted missions, and a persistent pressure placed on Japanese airfields and logistics. But the human ledger reads as a different kind of accounting. 121 fellows listed as killed or captured, 130 aircraft taken from the skies, and dozens of families who received telegrams that could not be softened by numbers.
The Tokyo Club changed the course of the air campaign over Japan, but it did so at a cost that was painfully evident to any man who walked the line in the dusk. In the quiet after hostilities wind down, the pilots who remain carry marks that are not on any official form. They have the small rituals of survival, checking each other's straps twice, keeping cigarette packs for mates who no longer smoke, and tracing the names of lost friends in the condensation on beer cans. They remember the haywired sorties and the perfectly executed ones with equal clarity. They remember the faces of bomber gunners who waved with a relief that looked almost like worship. They remember, too, the nights they spent piecing together the island's ragged moral fabric, donning coats for funerals, attending informal wakes, and loading mail for the next squadron rotation. Commanders and historians will later debate the full extent of strategic change. Contributing factors are always many: logistics, industrial capacity, naval blockades, and diplomatic shifts. But within that matrix, the actions off Iwo Jima stand out. Fighters that could reach the Japanese home islands, even for limited windows, introduced a dynamic that had not existed earlier in the Pacific campaign. They reduced the naked vulnerability of the B-29, forced the Imperial Japanese Command to divert scarce resources to air defense, and eroded the confidence of pilots who once had freedom of action over their own skies. It is accurate to say that these fighter pilots materially changed the course of the air campaign against Japan. It is equally important to say that they did so amid relentless danger and a human price that cannot be tabulated without emotion. The men of the Tokyo Club are, in the end, both technicians of war and human witnesses to its costs. Major Jim Tapp's name, Lieutenant Dick Hintermere's steady judgment, Captain Todd Moore's reliability with a green-tailed Mustang, First Lieutenant Robert Scomra's instinct to stay with a straggling bomber. These are the kinds of instances that foreground how change is made. By decision under pressure, by small acts of courage, and by an institutional willingness to learn and adapt. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph "Smoky" Walther's insistence on improving rescues saved lives that otherwise might have been lost, and his practical humanity becomes part of the unit's legacy. When historians assemble narratives, they often look for a single hinge: one battle, one decision, one hero. The story of the VLR Mustang operations out of Iwo Jima resists that simplification. It is a sequence of hinges. April 7th's baptism of fire that proved the concept. The daily grind of mechanics and medics that made sorties possible. The brutal correction of Black Friday that humbled ambition. The precise follow-up on June 10 that proved resilience. And the months of strafing and interdiction that followed. Together, these episodes constitute a continuous, hard-won change in how air power was applied to Japan. So, discover the fighter pilots who changed the course against Japan not as mythic figures placed on pedestals, but as a community of men, pilots, surgeons, mechanics, and sailors, who stitched together invention, courage, and sacrifice under the most trying of circumstances. They changed the operational calculus of the Pacific Air War. They altered bomber survivability. They compelled adaptation in the Imperial Japanese defenses. And they left, in their wake, a complex ledger of triumph shaded deeply by loss. If you want to explore these missions further, check the links below to primary source mission logs, veteran interviews, and a curated playlist about Pacific Air operations. Support the channel for more deep dives into these pivotal and often overlooked chapters of World War II history. Thank you for watching and for honoring the memory of those who flew, fought, and sometimes never returned.